Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle and thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com. As we go through the Class of 1999 series, one thing that is interesting to note that even if the films that I'm doing with the various filmmakers and friends throughout this series were not necessarily their first choice. They were, in fact, choices of the filmmaker or friend, and there are films that they wanted to talk about, and so that's definitely the case today, as we bend the rules just a bit. This is a movie that played at the Toronto Film Festival in 1999, although it did not get a U.S. release till about 2000 or 2001, I think. But nonetheless, given our recent discussion on Godzilla, I was definitely intrigued to watch Gamera 3 Revenge of Virus and discuss it with filmmaker and friend Matthew Saliba. And I'm looking forward to doing that discussion. So thank you very much for joining me again, Matthew.
Oh, no, thank you very much. It's great to be back.
So before we dig into this particular Gamera film, if you could set the stage a little bit with regards to the history of Gamera in terms of his cinematic legacy.
Sure. So it probably comes as no surprise that in the wake of the success of the original Godzilla and all the sequels that followed in the 60s, Dai, the sort of rival studio to Toho in Japan, decided to jump into the kaiju business, as did many studios in Japan at the time. And in 1965, they came out with Gamera, the Giant Monster. Now, the thing about Gamera is that I sort of look at, for me, Gamera is kind of like the Inland Empire of kaiju. And by that, I mean, that might seem like a funny comparison to make, but hear me out. So, Inland Empire, David Lynch is one of my favorite directors, and I have tried my damnedest to like Inland Empire. Like, I want to like Inland Empire, but I just can't for whatever reason. And that kind of sums up my feelings with Gamera, at least for the classic '60s movies. It's just there's Gamera's a bit of a, to say the least, he's a bit of a tough sell to the non-kaiju crowd, in the sense that, he is kind of like a dopey looking monster. He's a turtle, for starters, and he also happens to be a flying turtle. And this is something that Roger Ebert pointed out in his review of the 1995 Gamera film that came out. So Gamera is obviously not a cyborg. He's an organic creature, yet he seems to have these sort of rocket jets that stick out of various orifices on his body. And Roger Ebert was the one who pointed out that, because he's an organic creature, he's obviously his ability to fly obviously stems from the fact that he is relying on the power of farting, for lack of a better word. So he's for those keeping track, he's not only a turtle, but he's a flying farting turtle. And furthermore, he's also a friend to all the children of Japan, particularly little boys who wear short shorts. So he's a flying farting turtle who likes little boys. So needless to say, even the most hardcore of kaiju fans are a little embarrassed by Gamera. That's not to say that there isn't some gems in that original run of movies. From 1965 to 1980, they put out 8 Gamera films. And I would say, for anyone interested in looking at the classic ones, you can't go wrong with Gamera versus Vira's, or Gamera versus Giron, because I think that's when they sort of realized that it feels like that's when the studio was kind of in on the joke, and they realized what they had on their hands, and they sort of abandoned any plans to take Gamera down any serious path. and they sort of embrace the goofiness of the films. Of course, some might argue that if you really want to save time, you should just watch Gamera Super Monster, which came out in 1980, which is perhaps one of the most notorious examples of a kaiju film relying on stock footage, because it literally is a greatest hits reel of all the previous 7 movies. So if you want to save time, just watch that, because that's literally the entire library of Gamera films. But it's important to point these things out because this is really one of those rare examples of a sort of a reboot being better than the original lineup of films, because by the time the mid to late 90s rolled around, a director by the name of Shusuke Kaneko who was a lifelong Gamera fan. He was basically given the keys to the kingdom and given almost carte blanche to sort of do what he wanted with this character and this franchise. And the result was a trilogy that began with Gamera Guardian of the Universe in 95, and then Gamera 2 Advent of Legion, and then the one we're talking about today, Gamera 3 Revenge Virus. And this was a franchise that not only reinvented Gamera and presented him as a credible, serious threat that could even potentially rival Godzilla in terms of popularity and success. I mean, after all, like Gamera, the first Gamera film got thumbs up from Roger Ebert, so there's something to be said for that. Something even a Godzilla film never received. So it reinvented that character, but it also really reinvented the way kaiju films were made from that point. One of the things we touched upon in our chat about Godzilla a couple weeks back was how the original 1954 film was very solemn and very serious, and you saw firsthand the impact, the destruction of a creature like Godzilla roaming through Tokyo would have on people if this event were to really happen. But then almost immediately, starting with the second in that Godzilla film, the Godzilla films, they sort of moved away from the Japanese people, like the effect that kaiju were having on the Japanese people, and it almost just became more of a circus where it was just about monsters fighting each other.
Yeah.
What Kaneko really did with the Gamera trilogy, especially with Gamera 3, was show the impact of a kaiju roaming through the city, what that would actually have on the people. I mean, it was like the people weren't sort of like scurrying ants, as the cliche is with these movies, where you see a bunch of Japanese people running through the streets saying, oh, it's Godzilla. You actually, like, for example, like when Gamera shoots his radioactive breath, you actually see it hit people running in the streets, and they burst into flames. And that, and when I saw that the other day when I was rewatching the film for the podcast, I was actually quite shocked at how violent and how realistic and gritty these films are. And that was something that had been lacking even in the Godzilla films, which are sort of the gold standard for this genre.
Yeah, I mean,
go on. Sorry.
No, go.
Oh, no, I was just going to say from. Okay, I was just going to say from that point on, when Toho rebooted their own Godzilla films for the early part of the millennium, you saw a lot of that sort of translate from Gamera to Godzilla, where they sort of tried to return to the gritty roots of the 54 original, to the point where they actually hired Shusuke Kaneko to direct a Godzilla film. And not surprisingly, that was in the minds of a lot of people the best of that genre since the 54 original.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things, and the part of the reason why I'm actually kind of excited about doing this particular film is because it's a film that most people are probably not terribly familiar with it, unless you're familiar with kaiju cinema in general. So I hope that this podcast will have people seeking out this trilogy in particular, and maybe going back into the history of Gamera and leading them into more of an appreciation of what kaiju cinema can do. Because that is one of the things that I really was quite taken by, because I'd never seen any of the three movies in Kaneko's trilogy myself. This was my first experience, and it's a bit jarring because obviously this is, like you said, this is very much a continuing story, especially two going into three. You get enough of an idea of what happened in two to where you're not entirely lost if you just pick up on Revenge of Iris. But I definitely do plan on going back and watching the first two movies in his trilogy after watching this movie, because it's really quite striking, and it is it's legitimately scary, and you can see the comps to the original Godzilla movie are quite earned, I think.
Oh yeah, I think so. And I mean, and again, when you consider, and actually, to be honest, I would almost recommend like watching, I guess, any of the classic Gamera films just right before the this trilogy, just so you can see the jarring difference in styles.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to be fair too, I mean, the Gamera trilogy gets a lot of credit for establishing a sense of continuity that wasn't really as important when you look back at the classic Gameras or Godzillas. I mean, in the classic Godzilla, for example, there was always sort of a loose continuity in the sense that you would sometimes, well, particularly with the first three or four films, they literally sort of flowed one to each other, but theoretically you could pick up any Godzilla film and just take it from there. But in the 90s, I know when Godzilla was rebooted in the 90s, starting with Godzilla 1985 to Godzilla versus Troya, it's basically one long arc over 7 films. And so I think that was definitely something that inspired Kaneko's trilogy. Obviously, with it being 3 films, it's a tighter trilogy. And I mean, you could theoretically pick up 3, because again, when I rewatched 3, I hadn't seen the first 2 in a long time. And I was able to follow the story. I mean, there are some references to what happened previously. I mean, it's not a trilogy in the sense that, let's say, the original Star Wars was a trilogy, where obviously it would help if you watched the first one, but I think it's probably a more rewarding experience if you do go through them chronologically.
Mm-hmm. And this is, and that is one of the things that I think if it weren't for those callbacks to the previous films and the trilogy, I probably would have been just lost, and I'm not sure how I would have felt about this movie. But the fact of the matter is, this is a very fascinating story, and it's one where this is essentially a revenge story, is what it boils down to. The main girl in the movie has basically had her village wiped out by Gamera, and
Yes.
she's basically her rage is what drives her in this movie. She wants revenge on Gamera, and so help me out a bit. She finds an egg, doesn't she?
Yes, and she develops a psychic link with the villain of the film, and which is another sort of inspiration, I think, taken from the Godzilla films of the 90s, because that was a recurring motif in those films. So yeah, I mean, so there's that psychic link which she uses to sort of fight Gamera. So it's sort of interesting, because as much as this is a kaiju versus kaiju movie, and there's plenty of scenes that play into that, it's also really interesting in the sense that it is a story about a human being going one-on-one against Gamera, with another kaiju used as proxy. It almost feels like a predecessor to Pacific Rim, in the sense that you almost have someone living vicariously through a kaiju.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things that struck me the most about watching this, and it's like the character of Ayana, who's the main girl in this, and the creature that becomes Iris. It's so well imagined. It comes out. You start off. It's kind of a cute design. It's in how it's, but then the way it evolves, it's really evocative and really bizarre and really. And so once you see the end result, it gets really surreal in the way Iris's sort of final form becomes, and it's Kaneho does such a good job in staging this movie. It feels like there are real stakes at work in this movie. It's not just, oh, let's put two monsters and destroy a city or something like that. This is a real film with weight, and that's one of the things I really loved watching it as the film progressed.
Well, that was definitely something. Pardon me. That was definitely something that made Kaneko's films stand out, and in many respects, because obviously there's people who consider Godzilla '54 to be the the standard by which all further kaiju films are sort of compared to. But then there's a generation that grew up with this Gamera trilogy, and many people consider some of the things that Kaneko did in this film to be the new gold standard
Mm-hmm.
for this type of film, not just with the staging of special effects, which are really remarkable, and so much so that all three films were given theatrical releases in the States, which was previously unheard of for any real kaiju movie.
Mm-hmm.
But also for adding that human element, because in many respects, as the franchises would go on, even with the Gamera films in the '60s, I mean, the humans almost became sort of stock characters that didn't really have any impact on the
Mm-hmm.
story. Whereas
Yeah.
in this film, there's an argument to be made that the scenes involving the humans are just as, perhaps if not more, important and emotionally wrenching than anything involving the kaiju,
Mm-hmm.
which is pretty remarkable when you consider the monsters that are in this movie.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me is just how this feel. We talked a little bit about Godzilla 2000 on our Godzilla podcast, and it strikes me just it's amazing to me just how much more polished, and how much more scope this film seems to have than that one.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, Godzilla 2000, and it's interesting because I think, if I'm not mistaken, that film was released in 1999 in Japan,
Mm-hmm.
and the same year as Gamera 3. So it just kind of shows you the difference in mentality between the two studios at the time,
Yeah.
because truth be told, I would say the success of the Gamera trilogy and its influence was only really felt, probably, well, actually probably with the film that Kaneko ended up directing for that Godzilla franchise.
Mm-hmm.
Because yeah, Godzilla 2000 and the one that came afterwards, Godzilla versus Megaguirus, were very much following the trend of previous films and not quite embracing the more mature human element that Kaneko brought with the Gamera films. But then starting from GMK onwards, there's definitely, you could definitely tell that there's a consistency in terms of the artistic vision.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is a movie that really it's it casts Gamera in a very different light here, and I think it's because of the fact that so much of it is putting us in Ayana's perspective and her point of view, and so while we can see that Gamera has done some good in terms of destroying some of these monstrous bird type creatures in the previous films. You do understand sort of like why this one character in particular would see Gamera as a villain more than uh, something that is heroic.
Yeah, and I think that's that sort of subtlety and nuance is definitely a callback to when kaiju was first launched as a metaphor for World War II, and not only that, but I also feel that again, I do feel like there are a lot of parallels. I keep bringing up the '54 Godzilla, but I
Yeah.
do think that there are a lot of parallels to that,
Hmm.
and it's interesting because because you hadn't really seen that in any film after that original film. Especially like in the case of a film like Destroy All Monsters, where you had 10 to 12 plus kaiju. Um, you know, uh, I would love to have seen a follow up film that sort of examined everything from the perspective of the humans who had to experience that, because we as fans are enjoying the sort of royal rumble between all these giant monsters. But at the same time, if this happened, here in Montreal or down in Georgia, we would have a very different perspective.
Yeah.
So that's what's very interesting, because you hadn't really seen that. And now that I think about it, I mean, they certainly explore that quite a bit in '54, but I would almost feel like this takes it one step further in the sense that while Godzilla in '54 was a villain, unquestionably a villain, in this case, Gamera was trying to do good, because he was presented as the baby face
Hmm.
of this franchise, whereas in her by her perspective, he's a villain. And again, it's that sort of subtlety and nuance that I feel is kind of missing. And we touched upon this in the last podcast with these upcoming MonsterVerse films that Legendary are putting out.
Yeah.
And again, I'd almost be really curious to see, although I don't know if it would ever happen, but I'd love to see Shusuke Kaneko get his hands at doing an American Godzilla film,
Mm.
or if they ever decide to adapt Gamera for American audiences. Though
Yeah.
I don't know if that'll happen, but that would be interesting to see.
And the thing is, I would worry that they would I would worry that an American filmmaker would play up sort of the campy aspects of that and the cheesy
Yeah,
aspects of that, as opposed to taking it seriously. Now, given the way that the sort the or sort of the first MonsterVerse movies have turned out, whether you're talking about Godzilla or whether you're talking about Kong Skull Island, there's a possibility of that happening, but especially once you consider, what you described as far as like, Gamera, and at first it's like, yeah, that's probably going to be a bit too far.
yeah, and at the same time too, there is such a thing. I might have forgotten to mention this, but like, while I should have probably clarified this, like Kaneko was eventually given carte blanche, and I think one of the things, if you get a chance to watch the trilogy in chronological order, the first film, Guardian of the Universe, is definitely the more traditional of the three, in the sense that, don't get me wrong, Gamera is presented in a much more serious and credible light than he ever was in the '60s, but he still does a few of the sort of cheesy things that
Yeah.
people have come to love or hate about Gamera.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, eventually it evolved into a much more mature and nuanced story by the time the third one rolled around. But one of the things, like, Kaneko really wanted to change quite a bit of the character, and the opinion of the studio at the time was that, you know, yeah, you can push this in a more serious light, but at the end of the day, Gamera is Gamera, and there's really only so much you can change about the character before he just becomes a different monster altogether.
Right.
And whether you like the fact that he flies around like a UFO or not, that's what makes him him. And as much as people might want to see a different take, there's only so much that people are willing to accept.
Mm-hmm.
By there's only, and just look at the Star Wars films. There's,
Yeah.
with the fanboy reaction and stuff. There's only so much you can change a film before people start rioting in the streets.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so you're right. As interesting as it would maybe be to see an American take on that, I guess maybe Americans, not just American, I guess the West in general, might not be as aware of Gamera as they might be as Godzilla, because
Right.
Godzilla, whether you've seen a Godzilla film or not, most people would probably know who that is if you mentioned it.
Yeah.
Whereas Gamera, he's a bit of a, although there was a reference of him on The Simpsons, so I mean maybe there is some hope about seeing a U.S. Gamera at some point.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm not really sure what direction that could potentially go in without it becoming sort of a campy film.
Yeah. I mean, there are moments in Revenge of Iris that I found a bit cheesy near the end of the movie, but I mean, there's still also there's so much of the production, the visuals are just so striking throughout most of the movie. It's like this we're making I apologize if we're making it sound like, this overly serious movie. It's serious, but it's also a monster movie, and it's
Oh
it's
yeah.
also a disaster movie. And I mean, it definitely plays into some of the formula of 90s disaster movies, but it also takes there's weight to the actions in this movie. And I think that's the thing that stands out the most about it.
Oh, I think so too. Yeah, I mean, and you're right. I mean, there it definitely feeds into some of the cliches at the time, and in many respects, especially since it came out during the height of the whole disaster movie era, it almost makes me glad that Roland Emmerich never got his mitts on this.
Oh God, yeah.
uh, but yeah, it does. But
Hmm.
again, like I feel like whether you're watching a disaster film or a serious art house film, I think you need to go in with certain expectations and also understanding the genre of film that you're watching too,
Hmm.
because you get again by this point, the kaiju machine had sort of been milked dry as far as ideas go, and so this was sort of a welcome breath of fresh air, just in terms of the way it was presented.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because as much as Godzilla is sort of considered the king of the monsters, it's very interesting to note that Godzilla's success has often been predicated on the success of monster films that kind of came before it. Like when you stop and think about it, the original 54 film was really only made because of because King Kong, the original King
Right.
Kong, had been re-released in 52, and that was such a huge hit, which
Mm.
inspired Toho to sort of want to make their own monster movie. And when Kong was resurrected in the 70s by Dino De Laurentiis, that's when Toho got the idea to eventually reboot their Godzilla movies
Yeah.
with Godzilla 85. And then in this case, because Gamera was such a huge hit and it took such a bold new direction for that genre, they decided to follow suit with their own films in the millennium. So, yeah, I mean, in many respects, Gamera sort of is that sort of benchmark
Hmm.
for the current wave of movies. Um, Although one thing I'd love to see, and I'm not really sure. I mean, I guess it's a rights issue and whatnot, but I think like a lot of people, I would love to see a Gamera versus Godzilla film at some point.
Hmm. It's weird. Yeah, and I guess because of the fact that they were separate studios, which I was not entirely familiar with. Yeah, I guess it does make sense that that hasn't happened.
I mean, they could always. I imagine it would probably be a situation similar to, let's say, Batman v Superman, where
Right.
they start off as enemies, but then King Ghidorah teams up with Gauss or
Hmm.
one of Gamera's villains. I mean, as long as there's no scene where Gamera or Godzilla has his foot on. Godzilla has his foot on Gamera, and he says something about Martha. It's like, oh, it's like, how do you know that name?
Oh wow.
But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. They're yeah.
yeah. Well, on that
There's
note,
not really much to say about that. There's not much I want to say about that. Uh, yeah, I mean it's one of those things. Yeah, I'm just I'm glad that you chose this because of the fact that it's like it it made me think. It made me it sort of helped pique my interest a little bit about not about movies beyond Godzilla when it comes to kaiju movies. And I mean, one of my favorite movies of the past decade is Pacific Rim. But
oh yes,
it's like, and and we discussed on the Godzilla podcast that I was a fan of the Gareth Edwards one, even though you have much better idea of how they could have made that even more personal, um, and
Oh well, I mean,
made that a little bit more in vein of what Ishiro Honda did in the original Godzilla, and this and that's one of the things that I like about this is that it fits in that same vein of the Ishiro Honda movie, and there's there's an affection for the genre as well as fantasy in it, and there's real scary elements of this movie, but it's still fun to watch, and it doesn't get overly serious, and it basically it walks that fine line in terms of genre very well, I think.
oh, I think so too. And also, don't get me wrong. I mean, as much as I love the 54 original Godzilla, and how in the serious direction it took, I'm not sure I'd want to watch 29 other movies like that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
eventually, at some point, So I mean, so again, as much as I appreciate when the kaiju genre is taken in a direction where it can serve as a metaphor for political and social issues.
Yeah.
I mean, again, at the end of the day, it is giant. It is men in rubber suits fighting each other over miniatures. So I mean, and that's what I really appreciate about the Gamera trilogy as a whole, especially Gamera 3, because it is a film that very much strides that fine line between, dare I say, art house and sort of a mainstream action blockbuster. And if nothing else, I mean, this actually just kind of came to me right now because on the last podcast you had asked me what is the biggest misconception that people have of kaiju films, and I was talking about how they think it's just sort of cheesy popcorn fun, and I can't believe I forgot to mention this, but I think perhaps the biggest misconception about these films is that they're cheaply made, in the vein of, let's say, an Ed Wood movie.
Right.
Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, when you watch enough of these movies, I mean, I could definitely put together a list of some of non-Gamera Godzilla films for you to watch. That'll, I'll put it this way: you'll have more films to put on your bottom 50 list of worst movies. But there are badly, cheaply made films. But I would, anyone who would say that to me, I would point them in the direction of Gamera 3, because that's a film that, if you didn't know any better, you could almost mistake that for a Hollywood action film, because the effects are so slick and the action is so well shot. That's something else too. Something I really appreciated just from a filmmaker standpoint is, because it's obviously very difficult to shoot this kind of action without it seeming like it's just a guy in a suit. So I really like the fact that there's a lot of low angles, and there's a lot of shots taken from the human's perspective, that a lot of forced perspective in this movie.
Yeah.
That Kaneko does really well, to the point where, if you were a youngster watching these movies, you would almost be hard pressed to think or not think that these were real creatures that somehow the filmmakers got a hold of and were shooting. It's that well done. So yeah, I mean, anyone who would say that kaiju is cheaply made, I would point them in the direction of this and say, no, this is peak kaiju when it's done right.
Yeah, and this is definitely and this is definitely an example that you're right. It looks like, if you didn't know any better, you could mistakenly look at this and say, oh, well, this was a Hollywood production, and it's like, no, it wasn't, but it certainly looks like that, and that's one of the things I that's one of the things that I like the most about it, and that's one of the things I was most impressed by, because it's like, yeah, I've seen some of those older Godzilla movies, and yeah, they're just kind of cheesy, and it's like, at a certain point, yes, it's hard not to get into the silly with that. But at the same time, it's like, there are also ways that Kaneko shoots when Gamera and Iris are going after one another. It's just really weird to watch, and it's real. It's a bonkers movie to watch, but it's really fun in that way.
Oh yeah, no, it is, and also it's interesting. Some people might be interested to know that the film sort of ends a little bit on a cliffhanger,
Mm-hmm.
which unfortunately never really got resolved, because there was another Gamera film made in 2006 called Gamera the Brave. And a lot of people were kind of hoping that this was going to be the sort of to tie all the loose ends from the end of Gamera 3. But unfortunately, it was just it's a standalone film that has no relation to the trilogy. And if anything, it's more of a callback to the 60s films. It's in this, although it's kind of interesting because it has the vibe of a 60s Gamera film, but with the sort of aesthetic of the work that Kaneko did in the 90s. But it has no relation whatsoever to the trilogy. But for all the completionists out there who need to see every Gamera film, it's worth tracking down if you can find it.
When did you first see this?
I was thinking about that before we started this. I want to say Fantasia. The Fantasia Film Festival here in Montreal. For those who don't know, it's North America's largest. It's basically the Cannes of genre film festivals.
Okay.
It's an event that runs for 3 weeks, and so at some point, this was obviously after the film had been released in '99. If I'm not mistaken, it was. I think they may have shown it in 2000 or 2001.
Okay.
I think they had shown. I think it was a special night where they were showing all three back to back to back.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember seeing it on the big screen, and it was interesting because there were lots of parents who brought their young kids to see this movie.
Oh, wow.
Thinking of course,
Yeah.
well, it's thinking. Well, I mean, I even heard people referring it to it as a Godzilla movie because Godzilla is kind of like, it's like if you refer to a spaghetti western as a Clint Eastwood movie,
Right.
it's become so synonymous with the genre. It's just so so obviously it's obvious that they hadn't seen a Godzilla in a really long time, a kaiju film in a long time, because they obviously assumed it was a family-friendly film. So, in those scenes where I was talking about how, the radioactive fire hits people and they burst into flames, I seem to remember kids crying during the movie because it's obviously pretty intense for them. So yeah, those are some of my memories of watching it in the theaters, and then of course, when they eventually came out on DVD, I snatched them up and rewatched them, and yeah, unfortunately, I don't think. I know the U.S. got the theatrical release. I don't believe they were ever theatrically released in Canada, but yeah, thankfully, it's because of places like Fantasia, we were able to see them in theaters here. But yeah, that was my experience, and there was lots of even from some of the adults, there were loud, audible gasps during some of the more intense scenes in the film, which I think once again is a testament to Kaneko's ability as a director.
Yeah.
Also, it's interesting as you were talking earlier about the design of Iris and how it almost looks very nightmarish. And for those who might not know, Kaneko's before he even got the job on Gamera, he directed one of the segments for I believe it's called Necronomicon. It was like a Lovecraftian a horror anthology film that he was involved with a few other directors. One of the other directors, I think, was Christophe Gans, who's the famous French filmmaker who
he did Brother of the Wolf, right?
Yes, yeah, that's what he did that. And I think the other director was Brian Yuzna, who was the producer of Reanimator and a director in his own right. So he's no stranger to that sort of that kind of imagery. So it was very inspired. So even looking back on it, even asking Kaneko to direct this trilogy was a pretty inspired decision because he didn't really have any sort of science fiction background other than that one segment that he directed. If anything, I would almost liken that to the fact that Adam Weingart was tapped to direct Kong versus Godzilla, the 2020 film coming out next year,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't know if you're familiar with Adam Weingart, but
Oh yeah.
he's oh yeah, so yeah, so I mean, you wouldn't think, he doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
his work doesn't scream kaiju, but
Yeah.
but much like a Kaneko, maybe he'll end up surprising us with making one of the more interesting entries in that
Yeah.
franchise.
And I've heard the name, but I'm trying to remember what else he's done.
He directed You're Next,
Okay, yeah, yeah.
and
That's
he
why
sort of
that's what I thought he had done. Yeah.
I mean,
And
he sort of
didn't he
he's
also
he's
didn't he also do the Blair Witch reboot a couple of years ago?
yes, yeah, he
Yes.
did that one too.
Yeah.
He's sort of it's one of the I don't know if you've heard, there was like a film movement. I think they're still making films, but it's called the Mumblecore. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so it was funny because like when I first heard that he was directing Kong versus Godzilla, my initial reaction was that, are these kaiju just going to mumble at each other for an hour and a half, but and then stare at their sneakers?
Yeah.
But yeah. But anyway, I mean, the point being that it's kind of I'm just thinking about it now, how it's kind of an interesting parallel where you've got guys
Mm-hmm.
who are, it's not necessarily known for their work in, high concept, big special effects driven science fiction films, but sometimes they could end up surprising you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's gonna be interesting to see what he does with it, because yeah, he really hasn't done he hasn't done anything nearly on that level. Because I mean, I've seen Uranus, I've seen that Horrible Way to Die, I've seen a couple of his films, and
Hmm.
yeah, yeah, that's definitely an interesting choice. I'm curious to see what he does with Kong versus Godzilla.
Hmm.
Um,
It's funny how anytime you talk about kaiju, it always comes back to Godzilla.
yeah. Well, I mean,
But
he's the. I mean, that basically. I mean, he's ground zero for it. I mean, that's what. I mean, unless you include Kong, but I mean, I think I think Kong was. Yeah, I mean, Kong is in that vein, but not really a part of that. So
yeah, but although, have you ever seen the Toho Kong films?
I've not. No.
Well, I mean, there was King Kong versus Godzilla, which I mean everyone
Right.
knows, but they also did another one called King Kong Escapes. I think that came out in '67, and that's the one where Kong fights Mechana Kong, which is his cyborg double.
Okay.
And there's the villain in that film. His name's Doctor Who, but not obviously not the Doctor
Right.
Who, but
Right.
that's an interesting film because you could tell that the costume for Kong is very much the worse for wear. Like, it's you could tell that costume had been on the hanger for a few years because it's fallen apart at the seams.
Well, what exactly, before we start to wrap this up, what we've spent a lot of time talking about the third part of this trilogy of Gamera films, because I mean it's the film that we're centering on, but for people who aren't familiar with the trilogy in general, what is sort of the basic arc of it? Without getting into too many spoilers for it, but I mean, if we have to, we have to. But just so people have an idea as to the arc of this series.
Sure. Well, one thing that is kind of glossed over if you watch the original 1965 film is that there's a scene at the beginning when Gamera is first introduced. There's a team of Japanese scientists and reporters who are at this Inuit village in the Arctic, and one of the elders from that tribe presents one of the scientists with this rock that is allegedly from the lost island of Atlantis, or the continent of Atlantis. And there's an implication that there were a race of Gamera creatures from Atlantis, but it's never really brought up again throughout that entire run of 8 films from the 60s. So this the 90s trilogy sort of delves more into that, which it basically sort of explains Gamera's background, and it also there's also a lot of references to the fact that Gamera needs to feed on something called mana, which is sort of addressed in the third film. And that's another connection to Atlantis. So there's more exploration of Gamera's background, and in many respects, this might seem kind of a funny comparison, but I would almost compare it to Batman Begins in the sense that as much as Batman Begins expanded on the origin story of Batman, to the extent that even the comic books didn't.
Yeah.
At the very least, the original Gamera gives you his backstory and explains, why for example, why he's able to fly, and why he likes children. So the first one does that. It also serves as a reintroduction to his, to I guess the Gamera equivalent of King Ghidorah. His arch rival is Gauss. So Gauss is given a reintroduction to the audience, and he's presented in a much more serious light than he ever was in the 60s films, where he was kind of like a goofy pterodactyl type creature. So there's that, and also, I mean, there's a lot more exploration about the interaction between humans and kaiju. More so than there ever was in even in the Godzilla films. I think there's more like characters have more of a because in the original films, children were always, the running joke was that Gamera was a friend to all the children, but never really explained why or how kids didn't sort of go crazy at the sight of a giant turtle carrying them in his hands. The 90s trilogy really explores that more. It sort of establishes that there is a bit of a psychic relationship between children and Gamera, that they can communicate with him in a way. And it's sort of almost like a metaphor for kids who don't feel the kind of love and kinship with their own family, that Gamera is sort of a loving stepfather, which again has very disturbing undertones when you think about it.
Yeah.
And, in light of the Leaving Neverland and whatnot. But so it explores that a bit. So it presents Gamera as a more mythological creature. I would almost compare it a little bit to, obviously they haven't gone into too much detail, but you know how in Godzilla King of the Monsters, the new one that's coming out this year, there seems to be an effort to sort of present these kaiju as the great titans of Earth, how they once lived, millions of years ago. In a nutshell, that's kind of what the Gamera trilogy does. It sort of presents Gamera as a creature that has defended the universe, has defended Earth for millions of years, and then he was when Atlantis sunk, so did he and his kind, and he's sort of the last of his kind. And there are forces out there that are trying to eliminate him because he's the only thing standing between a full-scale invasion of the Earth and ruin.
Okay. Yeah, and like I've said, I've only seen Gamera 3 right now, but I definitely want to check out the other two. I definitely plan on checking out the other two sooner rather than later. Before we wrap up, is there anything more that you'd like to say on Revenge of Iris?
Again, it's obviously it helps if you watch the first two, but at the same time, it's not a trilogy in the way, let's say, like the Matrix trilogy was a trilogy, or Star Wars or anything like that. You could theoretically pick up 3 and more or less be able to follow the action. And even and it's definitely worth checking out, if for no other reason. If you're the kind of person who, your knowledge of Godzilla begins and ends with, Godzilla chasing around his son in that Father's Day ad that airs every Father's Day, it would certainly be in your best interest to expand your horizons and see what kaiju can really do.
Hmm.
And also, I mean, again, if you're the kind of person who, and mind, I mean, these aren't judgment calls, by the way. I'm not trying to
Yeah.
say that these are bad people, but I mean, like, if your experience with Gamera has only been through MST3K,
Hmm.
you might be pleasantly surprised at what can happen when the franchise is given to a lifelong fan of the series, and yeah, just I mean, what happens if you give it to someone who really cares and is trying to make a yeah, that's the thing too. Like, not only is Gamera 3 a good kaiju film, I would argue it's a genuinely good film. Period.
Oh yeah.
And I think, and that's, or I would even say it's a great film. I mean, that's what differentiates a good film from a great film,
Hmm.
because I mean, there are tons of good genre films that cater to people who know all the archetypes and tropes. But I mean, a great film is a film that not only works on the level that it was intended to work on, but can transcend the boundaries of its genre and cater to people who would otherwise never be caught dead watching a kaiju film.
Right.
And I think that's what Kaneko. I mean, not to oversell it, although I guess
Yeah.
that's too late. But I mean, not to oversell the point.
We kind
But
of have, but the fact of the matter is, it's like that's one of the things that I like about this particular choice, this particular episode, is because of the fact that this is something that most people are not necessarily going to associate with this year. But at the same time, there is something that this is kind of a gem that, you on the year before, American audiences had that god awful Roland Emmerich Godzilla movie. The year after, they had a kind of cheesy Toho Godzilla movie in Godzilla 2000. Here's something in the middle that, unless you were an enthusiast at the time, you weren't necessarily aware of. But if you're so inspired by, like, even something like the Gareth Edwards movie or Pacific Rim, that it's like, this type of thing is kind of entertaining. I really like this. This is the type of movie that it's like, well, this might be right up your alley. And as somebody,
I think so.
And as somebody who was only familiar with Gamera from Mystery Science Theater 3000, I definitely came out of Gamera 3 with a greater appreciation of not only the genre in general, but in particular the way that somebody can bring a character like Gamera to life.
Yep, absolutely. Well put. Again, I really think that if people go in with an open mind, they'll be pleasantly surprised. And I'm glad you included this as part of the class of '99, because I mean, I know we're bending the rules a little bit.
Yeah.
Because technically, although in all fairness, I know back in my filmmaking days. Technically, the first public screening of a film is technically the year it came out in.
Right.
Because theoretically, you could shoot a film in the '60s, but if it only was screened in 2019, then technically it's a 2019 film. So we're not really breaking any rules here. It's technically a '99 film. But no, and that's a good point, because especially in light of what came out around that time, it is a breath of fresh air. And I mean, I'm curious to see. I mean, again, like I'm obviously a bigger Godzilla fan, but I'd be very curious to see, because I mean, again, from what I understand, there aren't any real plans to revitalize that or reboot the character. So I mean, I would love to see a Godzilla versus Gamera film. I know Toho is going to do a brand new Godzilla universe, so I don't know if there are any, because that is like the last big dream match if you're going to do that for a movie. And I don't know. I mean, I'd be sort of curious to see what they do if they were to bring it to the States. Although I will say this, I'll leave you with this thought: if they ever do bring it to the States and they decide to go full on camp with it, I would sincerely hope that they would put this film in the hands of Tommy Wiseau. Because if they are going to go full camp on it, because I I just bring that up because I know his next movie is he's making a shark movie apparently.
Yeah.
So yeah, so yeah, or maybe not. I don't know. Maybe that wouldn't be a good idea. But I don't know if they really were going to go the campy route. I mean, that would probably be the. Although I don't know. I mean, I don't know who would really be able to direct something like that because it's such a tricky character because there is just something so inherently goofy about him. But in the hands of the right person, he could be probably one of the more terrifying kaiju. So we'll see.
And so long as that quote unquote right person is not Roland Emmerich, I sincerely hope it would turn out all right. Well, Matthew, thank you very much for not only bringing this movie to my attention because I wasn't even completely familiar with it when you suggested it, but thank you as always for joining me on the podcast.
Oh no, it's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure doing this one and the other one as well. I mean, I never turned down any opportunity to talk about kaiju, and in many respects, I almost feel like we only scraped the surface. But thanks again. It's a real pleasure on my part.
I'd like to thank Matthew Saliba for once again joining me on the Class of 1999 series. I'm very grateful that we had this movie to talk about because it's a movie that most people are not necessarily familiar with, but it's one that I do think when you consider the genre of films that came out in 1999, I think it's something that holds up with any of them, whether you're talking about The Matrix, whether you're talking about Fan Mess, whether you're talking about even something like the 13th Floor, which I really liked, or any genre. 1999 was a fascinating year for genre, and I think the final part of this trilogy is definitely something that's worthy consideration with any of those movies. And so I definitely, if nothing else, I hope that people go search out the Gamera trilogy and this one in particular. It's not terribly available right now, unfortunately, but if you don't mind blind buying it, I know that's where I got mine on Amazon on Blu-ray, and it's such a good it was such a good experience. I'm glad I got a chance to watch it. Thank you very much for joining me at the Sonic Cinema podcast. Hit us up on Patreon at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. The Atlanta Film Festival is coming up in the beginning of Atlanta, and I've already got ideas as far as which films I want to talk about, which people I hope to talk to and get a look at, and in addition to coverage on the main website of Sonic Cinema, there's also going to be coverage exclusively for patrons, and so I hope you enjoy that as well. The Sonic Cinema podcast is found on YouTube at the Sonic Cinema podcast YouTube page, and as well as quick takes, little mini reviews or mini commentaries, and I might have more of those coming up. Coming up in the podcast, the Class of 99 continues on with another ridiculous horror movie, as well as one of the most anticipated movies of my generation. And those will hopefully all come out before the Atlanta Film Festival. For now, this is Brian Scuttle with the Sonic Cinema podcast, and thank you very much.